Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to this webinar. My name is Susan Rosney, and I'm Sustainability Advocacy Manager for Chartered Accountants Ireland, where I lead on advocacy and communications on sustainability for the Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on socially conscious AI and the CSRD. We know that AI holds immense potential for growth and delivery, but it's not without risk. Only yesterday, the IMF highlighted profound concerns it has about the risks of massive labour disruptions and rising inequality posed by generative AI, which is the ability of computers to automatically generate text or images using generative models. During this webinar, our speakers, David Connolly and Madeleine Parkinson, will cover the intersection of AI use and CSRD reporting obligations and the considerations required to ensure sustainable, socially conscious AI usage. Our first speaker is David Connolly, a senior manager in EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. With 20 years' experience in financial services, David specialises in double materiality assessments, gap assessments and implementation for financial institutions, including banking, insurance, payments and aviation leasing. He's a Fellow of Chartered Accountants Ireland and a member of the Irish Taxation Institute and holds an MSc in Renewable Energy and Environmental Finance from UCD. Madeleine Parkinson is a manager in EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. She specialises in social sustainability and the business and human rights ecosystem, assisting clients in meeting their ESG reporting requirements and assessing their social sustainability needs. She holds a Master's in International Human Rights Law from Trinity College Dublin, and her previous experience includes working in the UN Business and Human Rights Unit and in strategic human capital consulting. Before I hand over to David and Madeleine, I want to let you know that you can ask questions using the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring this throughout the session, and I can put the questions to our speakers. I'll try to get to as many as possible during our Q&A session, which will follow our speakers' presentations. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. So now, David, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Susan, and good morning, everybody. This morning we'll talk, or this afternoon we'll talk about the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, giving an overview of that. We'll talk about reporting AI technology under CSRD, and then Madeleine will talk about socially conscious AI, and then the applications, AI applications for CSRD reporting. So first of all, I know some of this will be familiar to a lot of you in terms of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. What is it? So the non-financial reporting directive was the directive we had up to this point. So it's been replaced by the CSRD. It'll be transposed into Irish legislation over the next couple of weeks. So 50,000 companies will be brought into scope in Europe through the CSRD, large companies, listed companies, although as we'll see in a minute, large companies, it's not a huge threshold to meet in terms of being in scope of CSRD. So 50,000 companies in scope is probably about 5 times as many companies that are in scope under the current directive, the NFRD. There's a mandatory application of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So effectively, these are like the accounting standards you would have for financial reporting. The ESRS is what we have to follow for non-financial reporting in terms of sustainability reporting. What we need to do in order to understand what we're going to report on is do a double materiality assessment to see what's relevant to us and to identify impacts, risks and opportunities in relation to the ESRS. It's required that you have it published under a specific section in the management report in your AFR, and that it's audited, so it's subject to limited assurance initially, and in due course it will be subject to reasonable assurance. And also there's enhanced responsibilities for audit committees. The CSRD is part of 2 other pieces of legislation. We've got the EU taxonomy and the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the SFDR. So these are interrelated pieces of legislation that the EU has brought in. The SFDR is mainly for the investment community, and then the EU taxonomy is the language that we use for sustainability reporting to stop what we call greenwashing. So if we go on to the next slide, then we can see when companies will be in scope. So the Commission approved the first set of ESRS in 2023. All member states must transpose the CSRD into their legislation by July 2024, so only a couple of weeks away. And then all 50,000 companies won't be in scope at the same time. So the first wave is the large listed companies. So companies that are already reporting under the non-financial reporting directive. So typically companies that are quoted on the stock exchange, they will be required to report next year for financial year 2024. So they will already have done their work in terms of what they're going to be reporting on. The big wave then is next year, 2025, reporting in 2026. So as I mentioned, large is not so large in terms of the size of the company. They only need to meet 2 of 3 criteria of 250 employees, 25 million in assets, and 50 million in turnover. So if they hit 2 of those 3 criteria, they're in scope in 2025 and reporting the following year. And then in 2026, listed small and medium-sized enterprises are in scope. And then the following year, more companies are brought into scope from outside the EU. So parent companies with operations in the EU of 150 million turnover are required, and meeting other criteria are required to report in 2029 for financial year 2028. So I suppose the benefit of being in the second or third wave is companies will see what the large companies are reporting in the first wave, so they have something to work off. Companies are reporting this year are effectively doing it blind to a degree because they can't. There's no precedent to work off. So if we just go on to the next slide, then this just outlines the ESRS. So the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, published by EFRAG, the Commission delegated responsibility to the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. And these are universal standards for all industries. So we've got 2 general standards, the General Requirements and General Disclosures, ESRS 1 and ESRS 2. ESRS 2 is mandatory for all companies, irrespective of materiality. And then the report under 4 reporting areas: governance, strategy, impacts, risks, and opportunity management, and metrics and targets. So when EFRAG was publishing these standards, they would have leveraged off other standards that were published in the voluntary sector over a number of years. So we had the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and other standards throughout the world that were large companies would be reporting on a voluntary basis. So instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, to a large degree, they try to leverage on those. So those 4 reporting areas would be familiar to anybody that is familiar with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. Then there's 10 sector agnostic standards. So we've got 5 environmental standards: climate change, pollution, water and marine resources, biodiversity and ecosystems, resource use and circular economy. We have 4 social standards: own workforce, workers in the value chain, affected communities, consumers and end users, and 1 governance standard, business conduct. So these standards are the same for everybody. So it doesn't matter whether you're a bank or a food processing company or a cement company, it's the same standards that you will be reporting under. What we'll see in due course is sector-specific standards. So we will see standards that are specific to industries, but for the moment we'll work off these universal standards. And also there will be voluntary standards for companies that aren't in scope that want to report. They will be published in 2 or 3 years' time also. So these are the only standards that we have at the moment, and they'll develop over time. So if we go on to the next one. So in terms of AI then, so I mentioned the various ESRS. So you're expected to report both on your own operations and your value chain. So in terms of through the lens of your suppliers, your customers, and so on. So just a couple of things that you might consider in terms of AI and how that would affect your reporting. So the first one we have there is the environmental standards. So we've got E1 climate change and E3 water and marine resources. So if you think of AI and heavy technology generally in terms of what it requires, so we see a lot in terms of data centers being in the news in Ireland in particular, because of the amount of electricity used, the energy that they require. So obviously that's something that would need to be reported on. And AI obviously requires that level of energy to hold the data that's required for generative AI. Similarly, with the data center example, they need to be cooled. So water use will be something that needs to be reported on if you're using AI. Then, as Susan mentioned, in terms of workers, displacing workers, whether it's your own workforce or workers in the value chain, if you're replacing or reducing your number of employees or employees elsewhere within your supply chain through AI, that's something that may need to be reported on. Then the other social standards are S3 and S4, affected communities and consumers and end users. So in terms of having the data of individuals, of customers, of employees also, all of that may be used by AI that needs to be taken into account in terms of reporting. And also using historical data. So for example, if you're a bank and you're using the AI for lending decisions, you need to think about, have you the correct historical data set? So when you're working off historical data, maybe decisions will be made that wouldn't be made by an individual looking at a loan application. So that's something that needs to be taken into account in terms of the historical data sets. And then governance, which is the only G standard in the ESRS. Like anything else, if you're going to be using AI, you need to have a rigorous process around it to ensure it's not abused, that it's making the right decisions for you, that you have the right levels of approval throughout your organization, and so on. So in terms of the legislation then that's been in place for the last number of years, we've put this slide together in terms of just not to show any kind of correlation between CSRD and AI. They're independent topics, if you like, but they're both been hot topics over the last 4 or 5 years in particular. So the CSRD officially became law in 2023 and transposed into legislation this year. And AI, there's been lots of regulatory initiatives over a number of years, including the EU AI Directive last year, which was an important piece of legislation. The last thing to mention, I suppose, before I pass over to Madeline, is in terms of these two topics and the legislation, Europe has been far ahead of other parts of the world. So in terms of sustainability, the EU has been way ahead of other parts of the world in terms of the piece of legislation through the CSRD. And similarly with AI, the EU has been ahead of the curve in terms of bringing through that directive last year as well. So I'll now pass you over to my colleague, Madeline.
Perfect. Thanks, David. So having addressed sort of the fundamentals of CSRD and how AI use may be reportable under CSRD reporting obligations, we'd like to take a step back and orient ourselves in the fundamentals of AI, understanding that it's a topic that's gained a lot of buzz and a lot of public interest in recent years. I myself was surprised to learn a little while ago that AI actually was first conceived back in the 40s. AI as a concept and a technology has really been around for a lot longer than many may think. So as I said, the mathematical model for building a neural network was first introduced in 1943, but machine learning, which is where artificial intelligence, where a machine is compiling data and drawing insights, really took off in the 1950s. There was a bit of a lull in between, but as recently as the early aughts, we've seen the invention of deep learning revolutionizing this field. And the difference between deep learning and machine learning is the number of layers that are being put into a neural network, with deep learning having layers up into the hundreds. And essentially, by layering complex data sets against one another, we started moving AI towards being able to draw insights in an expedient way that the average human eye could not. But what perhaps you've heard the most about is generative AI, which simply put refers to a category of AI which focuses on creating new content, data, or solutions that are novel and realistic. Understanding, of course, that any AI system is only good as the data which it is fed on. We wanted to share this context, first of all, to make sure that we're all oriented in the various iterations of AI over the years, but then also just to make sure that we are understanding why generative AI is creating such a buzz. Because they're capable of generating new examples which are similar to an existing data set, but don't simply replicate the data set, it's opening up new business opportunities, which I'm sure if you're on this call, you're probably well aware of all the different ways that generative AI is starting to be used. However, as someone a little bit more clever than me once said, with great power comes great responsibility. We would encourage people to, as they consider AI use, AI programs, business applications for AI, to keep in mind what we're calling socially conscious AI. And you may have heard other terms for this: responsible AI, ethical AI. They're all relatively the same. We like the term socially conscious because it really centers people. But that being said, we're talking about similar attributes which are intended to create an AI ecosystem that respects fundamental rights and is, in an ESG framework, is sustainable. So the attributes which we would like to address today in terms of socially conscious AI, the first is fairness, which is that an AI is being constructed to minimize bias in its algorithms and to mitigate or prevent discrimination against any individual or group. Transparency is about ensuring that AI systems and their decisions can be understood by the end users and stakeholders, including how someone's personal data is being used. It also means from an internal perspective that there's transparency in who is owning and who is accountable for AI use and its outcomes within the business. Inclusivity speaks to ensuring that AI systems are accessible and beneficial to a diverse range of users, respecting individuals and groups' cultural, social, and individual differences. Having an ethical AI system means that you're aligning your AI practices with ethical standards and values, ensuring that the AI that's being used is also intended to enhance societal well-being, and that there are measures built in both to the AI design and the AI maintenance to prevent harm to humans as a result of AI decisions or actions. Sensitivity to social context, we would encourage people to think about the checks and balances they're building into their AI system and maintenance to allow the AI and its use to adapt to evolving social contexts. An example which we like to give here is talking about the rise of gig workers. If you're using historical data sets, for example, to evaluate the creditworthiness of potential customers, does your historical data set reflect the changing social context around what qualifies as stable work? Finally, respect for privacy, which is to say that the AI safeguards personal and sensitive data, which it processes for use, and going back to transparency, that the people whose sensitive and personal data may be used by AI are aware of this, and are aware, in fact, that they're even talking to an AI at all if they're using a chatbot, for example. And on the right hand of the slide, we'd like to just talk about why it matters. So first, there's the regulatory compliance piece, and you would have heard a fair amount from my colleague David about that. And as well from Susan, with the rise of acts like the EU AI Act, it's important to understand the regulatory context around AI use and to anticipate risks to ensure that you're ready for future requirements. From a reputational standpoint, Socially conscious AI use can help safeguard your organizational reputation and prevent potential financial and brand damage. And that again goes back to what my colleague David was just sharing around the risks and opportunities associated with AI use. Realizing the value of AI, the core hypothesis here is that if an AI system is trusted, that will enhance your customer interactions, it will maximize the returns on your investment, and it will elevate the performance of the AI. I'd also add that if an AI is trusted, that means that you probably have robust AI risk management processes that your teams and your employees understand and implement on a daily basis. The fourth call out here is around reliability and fairness. So AI systems can make flawed or biased decisions. The question is, do you have that at the front of your mind every step of the way in setting up your AI program and maintaining it? And do you have checks and balances to make sure that any flawed or biased decision-making is being captured and rectified? And then finally, as we've already talked about a little bit, is responsive to change. Making sure that your AI systems are being designed with fluid social and environmental context in mind, ensuring that they are adaptable and responsive, and so that as you're adopting these new technologies, you're not in fact being left in the dust. So as my colleague David talked about, we think there's two lenses here. The first is, if you use AI, what might you need to report under CSRD? The other lens is, okay, you're going to tackle CSRD reporting. Could AI be of use to you in this, understandably pretty time and labor intensive process? Our answer is yes, with a caveat. We think that there are many opportunities for the use of AI in CSRD data collection and reporting. However, these do not come without their challenges. We'd also, as a blanket statement, just note from our experiences running double materiality assessments and CSRD engagements for a number of years now, that doing it right the first time and not cutting any corners, the importance of that cannot be understated. Once you have a better sense of what your company needs to be reporting and how it needs to be reporting, it may be advantageous to analyze technology usage then. Essentially, if you do it wrong the first time, then it's very difficult to refresh the following year. But that's our one footnote, that's our addendum to that point. But going to opportunities and talking about how AI could be of use in your first or in your subsequent CSRD reporting years. So AI can be useful for data analysis. So for example, AI algorithms can analyze large volumes of sustainability data, which can allow you to identify trends, patterns, and anomalies. AI can also be used to create dynamic visualizations and dashboards that can make sustainability data more accessible and make it feel more real for decision makers and stakeholders. An example I've seen come up quite a few times is that AI could potentially be used for calculating, say, GHG emissions, wherein a company would normally have to aggregate and analyze data across multiple disparate sources and different types of parameters. Stakeholder engagement is another potential opportunity. AI could be used to personalize reports for different stakeholders and to tailor messaging within those differentiated reports. AI chatbots could also be used to interact with stakeholders to gather feedback. From our experience, stakeholder engagement is one of the most maybe challenging isn't the right word, but it's certainly a very time-intensive process associated with CSRD, and CSRD and the ESRSs have pretty high, detailed explanations for the degree of stakeholder engagement which one is expected to assume as part of their DMA and CSRD reporting. So for example, a company using natural language processing could analyze qualitative data such as text from social media or stakeholder feedback and gauge public sentiment on sustainability issues. And this could be used as an input to meet their stakeholder engagement requirements without necessarily having to create bespoke stakeholder engagement opportunities such as surveys. Thirdly, data assessment support. So for example, AI algorithms can identify and analyze trends, risks, and opportunities in the external environment which may affect the organization. This could be helpful for predicting future trends and helping companies prepare for potential impacts before they arise. This could also be useful for the double materiality assessment, or DMA, for example, by overlaying value chain information with environmental or social data and using AI to draw predictive analyses for ESG matters. However, again, in our client expertise, we really can't overstate the importance of doing it right the first time. Our fourth point would be around data collection and integration. So AI can automate the collection of sustainability-related data from multiple different sources. We've already discussed that. But it can also integrate disparate data formats and ensure that the information is consistent and reliable. And importantly, AI systems can learn over time. So they can improve their ability to analyze data and to generate insights. And this can help organizations continuously refine their sustainability data collection processes. Reporting optimization, AI could be used for benchmarking. So for example, they can compare a company's sustainability performance against industry standards or competitors and provide insights on where the organization stands and how it could improve. AI could also automate the generation of sustainability reports or subsections of sustainability reports, with the caveat that my colleague mentioned, which is that you do need a human lens, especially when it comes to assessment, and that there needs to be a checking process. Anyone on the call who's used ChatGPT would agree that sometimes it can hallucinate. And finally, AI could be used to keep track of changing sustainability regulations and standards. So it can help organizations ensure that they fully understand all of their legal requirements. This would be especially relevant for companies who are operating in multiple different jurisdictions with different legal boundaries. And then finally, forward-looking planning. This is where AI could be helpful for suggesting ways to improve. So based on the data that you may have collected through your double materiality assessment or gap assessment as part of your CSRD reporting, AI could be used to suggest ways to, for example, optimize resource use or reduce waste or improve your overall sustainability performance. These predictive analytics could be used to predict future sustainability outcomes, such as energy consumption or waste generation. And this could help a company plan more effectively and set realistic, but also competitive sustainability targets. All that being said, there are, of course, some challenges, some of which I've touched over very briefly. We've organized these into 5 different types of risks, which I'll sum up very, very quickly. The first is a design risk, which is around, say, explainability and the user experience. Has your AI program been designed to be used for something like CSRD reporting or for sustainability analysis? There are algorithmic risks. For example, if algorithms are trained on biased data or have flawed assumptions, they can produce biased outcomes and perpetuate existing inequalities. There are performance risks such as reliability and scalability of an AI program, and data risks such as access and retention policies and issues with the use of sensitive or personal data, which would be especially salient for the ESRSs related to social information, such as workers in the value chain or consumers and end users. And finally, there are third-party partner risks. We would encourage anyone considering partnering with a third party as relates to CSRD or to AI to ensure that they're keeping in mind the stability of the vendor, trust in the vendor, that they can integrate third-party systems into their existing business processes, and that they're cognizant of any responsibilities tied to security vulnerabilities. So moving into some key questions for how to assess your AI program through an ESG compliance lens. We would encourage you to ask yourself these 6 questions, although they're by no means exhaustive. We think they're a good starting point for understanding either how you're using your AI or how you are thinking of using AI while keeping sustainability at the forefront. The first question is, where within your organization is AI being integrated and what categories of data are expected to be influenced? Do you, as a business professional, have a full sense and a well-grounded sense of how AI is actually going to be used and what kind of data needs to be fed into it? The second question is how do you identify and manage risks to maintain trust in your AI systems? And this goes back to both risk management, as David mentioned, but also the socially conscious AI principles, which we discussed. Thirdly, are you meeting AI-related regulations and anticipating requirements under ESG regulations? And the fourth or fifth are relatively related to that. The fourth is, what are the ESG reporting implications for your AI use? So that's what David spoke to. The fifth is, how can AI support meeting your ESG reporting requirements, which I walked us through a few examples. And the sixth is, what measures are in place to integrate ethical principles into AI development and maintenance? So again, are you building a socially conscious AI program? Or if you already have an AI program, are you evaluating and maintaining it with socially conscious matters at the forefront? I was pretty struck by this particular statistic, so I wanted to include it. That's that only 6% of companies have established guidelines for AI, despite 73% of business leaders acknowledging that guidelines are indispensable. Right now, especially when we're talking about generative AI, it feels a little bit like the wild, wild west. And this is an important moment, both in terms of technology and in terms of ESG sustainability, to bring these principles together for both business benefit, but also societal and environmental benefit. And before we move to Q&A, we wanted to leave you with a few considerations for both ESG and AI programs and partners. Considering the overlap that we've discussed today of these two disparate areas, there are a couple of just general principles we would encourage you to keep in mind as you're analyzing your programs and partners, be it for CSRD, AI, or a Venn diagram between the two. The first is to establish a sustainable framework. For both AI and CSRD, you'll want to make sure that you have a customized framework which is based on your business principles, regulatory requirements, and internationally recognized guidance such as the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, the OECD guidelines, among others, and that all of this is being tailored to your particular industry. You'll also want to embed socially conscious considerations at every stage of AI development and CSRD implementation, both for all of the betterment, all of the reasons that we talked through earlier, but also to make sure that you're ensuring both legal and ethical compliance. The second point is to bring cross-functional perspectives. I think the importance of having diverse voices in the room and thought diversity can't be understated. So for AI, you'll want to assemble a diverse team of multiple disciplines to implement and align AI technologies with your organizational values and ethics. For CSRD, you'll want to make sure that you're engaging a diverse set of stakeholders with very different priorities to capture all the unique perspectives on ESG matters that are within your own operations and along your value chain. And for both AI and CSRD, you'll want to take steps to ensure that any third-party partners who you're engaging are both qualified and experienced. And the third point we'd leave you with is around audit and assurance, and specifically the need to set procedures for audit and assurance in both your AI and your CSRD programs. For AI, you'll want to make sure that you're establishing guidelines and a risk management framework, which translates sustainable considerations into actionable steps throughout the AI lifecycle. And this includes regularly auditing your AI systems for ethical performance, updating its guidelines and its inventory for risk management and compliance and others. And for CSRD, you'll want to work with your relevant teams, be they legal, risk, compliance, audit, or others, to fully understand the limited assurance requirements that CSRD reporting obligations hold businesses to today. We'd also advise compiling a basis of preparation to capture your methodology as was applied in your double materiality assessment or any other relevant business activities tied to your CSRD reporting. So all that being said, we'll move to Q&A, but I'd like to leave you with one more thought, again, a quote from someone who's a little bit more clever than I, which is that if you have an AI opportunity and you're using an outdated or inefficient process, what you're going to end up with is just an expensive, outdated, and inefficient process. So the time for change is now.
Sounds like an update on the maxim of garbage in, garbage out, and the update is just the sheer expense of it as well. And thank you so much for that, Madeline and David. That was fascinating. And I have a couple of questions myself that have just kind of occurred to me as you were speaking. And we've got questions in from the audience as well. And just something you touched on there was that, is there a risk with your third party partners? You say that you have to ensure that they're qualified and experienced. And considering the newness of this, is that a risk that companies should look out for? And is there other steps they can take to minimize those?
Absolutely. So I was recently listening into the European Commission's, they had a recent conference on implementing the ESRSs and asking for lived experiences. And so I can't steal this particular quote, but what I will share is that the European Commission was strongly advising all of the participants to be careful of what they were calling cowboy companies or like cowboy providers. With CSRD and with AI, these are both new opportunities or obligations for companies that are requiring a lot of investment. And it's understandable why many companies would want to just go to a, we'll call them cowboy provider to help meet those requirements. But really, you just need to be aware of who you're working with and make sure that they're appropriately qualified, and make sure that they've done this before and that they're coming to you with real experience and real learnings.
And actually, now I'm conscious as I said that about the newness of AI. One of the factors that struck me in your presentation was how old it is, 1943. It's not being the first time that AI was, now obviously not in the stage that we know it now, and certainly not generative AI, but it was really interesting to see that kind of evolution of it. And on the subject of evolution of this and regulation, I wanted to ask you about we've heard about a number of regulations shaping the ESG landscape, which David touched on, and we've also seen the regulations that you've talked about as well, particularly the EU AI Act, which is targeting risks posed by AI and potentially an outright ban on some applications that carry unacceptable risks for the safety and livelihoods and rights of EU citizens. So where you are now looking to the future, do you see upcoming regulations influencing the strategies that companies are adopting for ESG and sustainability? And that question is for Madeline.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if we're thinking about upcoming regulations and how how the environment ahead of us is going to change, I'd probably focus on two. The first is the EU AI Act, which I know we've touched on pretty briefly throughout the presentation. But if you actually dig into the meat of it, it will require essentially due diligence for what's considered high-risk AI usage. And if we use financial services as an example, using AI to evaluate credit worthiness would be considered high risk because it could potentially intersect with the fundamental rights of consumers and of the public. So with the EU AI Act, it's not just making sure that you have risk management around your program, but that you have some of these social and environmental considerations baked into the way that you manage risks. The second, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just when you mentioned the credit worthiness, another one that just occurred to me, and I saw in an article in the Financial Times earlier, was the risk with employment as well, of looking at CVs and looking at, and you'd mentioned the gig economy for credit worthiness, but also the idea of maybe inbuilt biases knitted into the AI that would have to be reviewed on an ongoing basis constantly. Sorry, I cut across you there.
No, that's a great example. And I'll just add one more, which would be a lot of healthcare uses would be considered high risk under the EU AI Act because you're dealing with such sensitive, personally protected information. But the second regulation, which a lot of our clients are starting to ask a lot of questions about, is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, also known as CS3D or CS-D. This is the natural progressor or the next step to the CSRD, wherein the largest companies are going to be required to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence. So whereas today it's a reporting structure where they can comply, but if they're not in compliance, they can explain. Starting as early as 2027, companies are going to be expected to have and to prove, to provide evidence that they have and are implementing and updating due diligence into human rights and environmental matters. All of which is to say, if we think back to that timeline slide, the regulatory environment in these spaces continues to grow. And we would advise, or we would encourage companies who are starting to think about these matters for the first time to not only focus on the regulations that affect them today, but to try to future-proof their strategies and their plans and their programs against the regulations we already know are coming down the line.
Yeah, and the CSRD is so interesting as well, because what often people say is that it should have been introduced first, because there's so much in that then that now obviously people having to do the heavy lifting on that implementation and reporting would possibly disagree. But it actually brings me to my next question, in terms of we talk about the due diligence and we're talking about what companies are focusing on. David, where you see companies focusing their efforts in ESG matters, do you see them focusing more on climate and environmental issues, probably considering the urgency of the climate crisis with the risk to life as well as to businesses from the temperature increases and flooding and air pollution and what we see in terms of the physical risks and transition risks? Do you think that companies should be expanding their scope beyond environmental?
Yeah, I suppose, and that's what the CSRD does. It asks you to consider, all of the topics under the three headings of ESG, and that's why you do the double materiality assessment process. That's why you engage with your stakeholders. That's why you do the impact, risk, and opportunities with your subject matter experts. So the topics that get thrown out are the ones that get thrown out. But typically, we find, particularly in the financial services sector, that there's a heavier weighting to the social topics than the environmental topics. So E1 is typically in scope, ESRS E1 climate change, because I suppose it's broad, and also it's an area of focus with the regulators. So whether that's the central bank or other regulators, it's something that it wants banks, insurance companies, and so on to focus on. And then across the social topics, there are people businesses. So, own workforce is going to be an important topic, and all within that, whether it's, equality, whether it's to do with training and development and so on. And your consumers and end users is going to be very important as well. So those two in particular, ESRS S1 and S4, come through within that. But then there's subtopics within that. Things like financial inclusion comes through, which is a social topic, cybersecurity. I suppose the topic that we're on today in terms of data protection and privacy is very important. So financial services businesses have a lot of data on customers and staff. So I would say, typically there's more social topics coming through in our industry than environmental topics. E1 would typically be the main one. But then there's emerging topics that will come through over time, like biodiversity, for example, is getting a lot more focus. So it's probably not going to be reported on by all financial institutions in year one. Over time, it will become a more and more important topic. And just to finish up, G1 is very important as well. ESRS G1 because of the nature of the industry and the requirement for regulation. I just see one in the chat. Do you want me to answer that question?
Yes, please.
One in the Q&A because I know you're running short on time. So the question was when is reasonable assurance coming through? It hasn't been decided yet, so the EU typically leaves these things kind of loose. So it's iterative, but the indications are it'll be 2028 when reasonable assurance will come through. But they'll see how limited assurance is going. They may do it on a tiered basis like they are with CSRD, so through waves. So only the large companies will require reasonable assurance in the first year, and then only the PLCs in the first year, and then large companies in year 2, year 3, and so on. But it hasn't been decided yet. They'll see how limited assurance goes.
So watch the space for the assurance kind of
piece.
piece.
So it's 2028 is the kind of indications that we're getting.
Excellent. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but there is a question that if it's possible to ask to provide a quick answer, it'd be great to hear it. It was to ask if we could share examples of successful implementations of AI projects in various industries. And if that could be answered off the top of your head, that would be great. I don't know if it can be in the time allowed, which is now negative 1 minute.
I'm afraid that would probably be a whole webinar on its own, but I would direct anyone interested to check out ey.ai, which is our AI information hub. It's available for anyone to look at, and we have a number of different case studies where we talk about different AI applications that we've helped clients bring, and that's across a broad variety of industries.
And so thank you very much again and for that response, but also for a fantastic webinar. As we're now over time, I unfortunately do have to draw the webinar to a close, but it's been fascinating. Thank you so much, Madeline and David, for that, and to all of our participants for attending. And I'd like just to draw your attention to Chartered Accountants Ireland Sustainability Hub for resources, and also to check LinkedIn for information on the sustainability bulletin that I put together once a week, but also for the technical roundup that my colleagues in professional accounting put together once a fortnight. And finally, to the e-newsletter from Chartered Accountants Ireland that collates a lot of the content as well, and also has information on upcoming events and other resources. But in the meantime, thank you very much again, all, and to Chris, our AV manager, for facilitating the call. And we hope to see you soon at future events. Thank you.